The wind scraped over the plain like a file over bone, lifting gray ash from what had once been a wagon and scattering it into the pale morning light. Elias Cross reined his horse and watched smoke coil from the wreckage, the smell of burned canvas and flesh twisting with the cold. He told himself to ride on. There was nothing left here worth the ache. But then he heard it, a dry cough small as a bird's cry. He dismounted, boots crunching through cinders, rifle loose in his hand. Beneath the axle, half buried in soot, a boy's eyes blinked up at him, black as obsidian, wide and unflinching. Apache. Maybe 8, maybe 9, the kind soldiers called stragglers, the kind they shot quick so they could sleep at night. Elias lowered the rifle slowly, the old scars on his knuckles tightening. "You alone, kid?" he asked, though he knew the answer. The child didn't speak, just pressed a burnt scrap of blanket to his chest, its corner stitched with beads. Elias glanced toward the horizon, where cavalry tracks cut the earth like claw marks. He could hand the boy over, earn favor with the fort, maybe wash the guilt off his hands for once. Instead, he took off his coat and wrapped it around the shivering shoulders. "Ain't safe here," he muttered. "Come on." The boy hesitated, then crawled out, bare feet blackened but steady. When Elias lifted him onto the horse, the boy flinched only once, then gripped the saddle horn with stubborn strength. As they rode toward the hills, vultures circled the ruin behind them, slow and silent as judgment. Elias kept his eyes forward, the weight of the child against his chest strange and heavy, like a question he didn't yet have words for. By the time the sun touched the peaks, he knew the decision would find him soon enough. Mercy had a way of drawing trouble, like smoke draws wind, and somewhere beyond the ridge, drums began to throb faintly through the valley, a heartbeat gathering strength in the dawn. The ride back to the ranch was long and silent, broken only by the wind and the groan of leather under the saddle. Elias kept glancing at the boy as if expecting him to vanish, but Tahan's small hands clutched the blanket tight, his dark eyes tracing the horizon with a watchfulness that made the land itself seem alive. The sun was falling by the time the ranch came into view. 2 tired corrals, a crooked barn, and a cabin built from years of stubborn survival. Elias swung down, lifted the boy gently, and set him on the porch, the boards creaking beneath the weight of something more than footsteps. "Ain't much," Elias said, "but it's dry." The boy didn't answer, just watched him with a wary stillness that felt older than his years. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and coffee, of the kind of loneliness that settles like dust and forgets to leave. Elias poured water into a basin and nodded. "Wash up. You're safe here." The word safe trembled as it left his mouth because he wasn't sure it was true. Not for the boy, not for himself. When Tahan dipped his hands into the cold water, his knuckles came away stained red from soot and blood, and he looked at the color as though it were something holy. Elias turned away and threw another log on the fire. Outside, coyotes yipped, far and thin. A man alone learned to ignore them. But tonight, their voices sounded closer, sharper. As he sat, he noticed the boy's beaded blanket again and reached out to touch its edge. Tahan flinched, then whispered, "My mother made." His voice was raw, like stone scraping metal, but it carried something soft beneath it. Elias nodded once, then handed him a plate of beans and bread. They ate without words, only the crackle of fire filling the room. When the last light died beyond the window, Elias doused the lamp and leaned against the wall, rifle within reach. The boy lay curled by the hearth, the blanket pulled to his chin, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the house breathe differently, like it was remembering what company felt like. Sleep came slow, thick with questions, and before it took him, he heard the faint beat of drums again. Farther than before, but steady, like a promise crossing the miles of cold and dust toward his door. By morning, the frost clung to the window glass like pale lace, and the world beyond the ranch lay quiet, except for the restless wind tugging at the shutters. Elias stepped outside, breath steaming, scanning the hills as if guilt itself might come riding out of them. He had woken before dawn to find Tahan already up, crouched by the barn door, feeding the sorrel mare handfuls of grain, his movements cautious but sure. The same patience Elias had seen once in scouts who'd survived too much. "You been around horses before?" Elias asked, voice low. The boy nodded. "My father. Chief horsekeeper." It was the most he'd spoken, and the sound of it sat in the air between them, soft and solemn. Elias chewed on the memory of his own father, buried back east under dirt that never forgave. "Then you'll help me with her," he said finally. And together, they brushed the mare until the coat shone like copper under the pale light. By midday, the trail dust rose to the west, thin lines of riders, small but moving fast. Elias stiffened. He took out his spyglass, the brass cold against his cheek. Blue coats, cavalry. "Stay inside," he said, pushing Tahan toward the house. The boy hesitated, his eyes cutting to the far ridge where something else stirred. Dark figures, barely shapes, slipping through the scrub like ghosts. Elias's throat went dry. Two worlds were circling his doorstep, and he was standing dead in the middle. He met the child's gaze and saw the fear there, the kind that remembered fire. "Do as I say, boy." Tahan obeyed, vanishing into the cabin while Elias saddled his horse and rode out a few paces. When Sergeant Reeves reined up, his grin was too sharp for the cold. "Morning, Cross," he drawled. "Heard you been keeping company with strays." Elias said nothing. The sergeant's men spread out behind him, rifles gleaming dull in the weak sun. "If you've seen a young Apache runt, you'll hand him over. Orders." Elias's stomach twisted. He thought of the boy asleep by the hearth, the beaded blanket clutched like the last thread of his world. "Ain't seen none," he lied. Reeves studied him, then spat into the dirt. "You always were a fool for lost causes." As the patrol rode off, Elias looked back toward the hills and saw smoke rising faintly from the pines. Signal smoke, spiraling higher with every breath of wind. The world was closing in. By dusk, the sky burned red behind the ridges, the kind of light that made the whole valley look like it was bleeding. And Elias stood at the window, watching it fade, while Tahan sat near the hearth, mending the edge of his beaded blanket with trembling fingers. The boy hadn't spoken since the soldiers left, though his eyes had followed every sound beyond the walls. "They'll be back," Elias muttered, not sure if he meant the cavalry or the ghosts of his choices. He moved to the table, checked the rifle, cleaned it with slow, deliberate strokes, and felt the silence between them stretch tight as barbed wire. When he finally spoke again, it was softer. "You ever had stew?" The boy shook his head. Elias ladled broth into a tin bowl and handed it over. Tahan lifted it carefully, sipped, then whispered, "You help me." "Why?" The question struck harder than any bullet. Elias stared at the fire, its light carving hollows in his face. "'Cause I once watched a kid die while men said it was duty." His voice cracked low, like a door long swollen shut. "Didn't sleep right since." Tahan nodded slowly, and for the first time, his mouth twitched toward something that almost looked like trust. They ate in silence until hoofbeats echoed faintly from the ridge. Elias froze. Tahan looked up, blankets slipping from his shoulders. "Inside," Elias said, though they already were. He blew out the lamp and eased the door open just enough to see shapes moving beyond the fence line, dark riders in the half-light, too quiet to be soldiers. The smell of wood smoke drifted in, foreign but familiar, the kind of smoke that came from cedar and sage. He turned back to Tahan. "Your people?" The boy's voice was barely breath. "Maybe." Elias shut the door and bolted it, the sound loud in the stillness. "Then tomorrow I ride out. Better I meet 'em first than they meet me uninvited." He didn't say what came next if they came looking for blood instead of thanks. The boy stood, stepped closer, and placed his small hand over Elias's scarred one. The gesture said more than language could. Outside, the horses in the corral shifted nervously as drums began to whisper again from far off. Low, rhythmic, the mountain's pulse returning. Elias felt it in his chest, like a verdict waiting to be spoken. The night came hard and silver. A thin moon climbing slow over the pines as the frost crept across the rails of the corral. And Elias saddled his horse without lighting the lantern. The creak of leather loud against the hush. Tahan stood in the doorway wrapped in his blanket, his small face half hidden, but his eyes bright in the dim. "You stay here," Elias said quietly, tugging the cinch tight. "If I ain't back by noon, take the creek trail south. You'll find a trading post 2 days out." The boy's jaw trembled, then stilled. "You come back," he said simply, not as plea but as order. Elias almost smiled at that. "I'll try." He rode out toward the ridge, the cold biting deep through his coat, the moonlight painting the ground in ghost color. The valley below glimmered with faint fires, Apache campfires scattered like fallen stars. He dismounted halfway up, tethered the horse, and moved forward on foot. Boots silent in the snow. Voices drifted on the wind, soft and guttural, not angry, not yet. When he reached the bluff, he saw them clearly. Rows of tents, warriors moving like shadows between the flames, and at the center, a tall man with white streaks in his braids, the glint of metal at his throat. Chief Kohana. Elias took a breath that tasted of smoke and memory, and stepped from the trees. A dozen arrows rose in an instant, bows drawn tight. He raised his empty hands. "I ain't your enemy," he said, his voice carrying over the wind. "There's a boy, Tahan, alive because I found him." For a moment, only the crack of the fires answered. Then Kohana spoke, his tone low but sharp. "The white soldiers took many sons. You bring one back? Why?" Elias swallowed hard. "'Cause I couldn't stomach watching another die for nothing." The chief's gaze flicked to the sky, then back to him. "At dawn we come for him. You will see what truth your words hold." Elias nodded slowly, though his pulse thundered. When he turned to leave, an old warrior stepped from the shadows and placed something on the ground at his feet. A single black feather. Not a threat, a warning, or maybe a test. By the time Elias mounted and headed back down the slope, the moon was sinking, and behind him the fires burned brighter, a signal written in flame across the mountain. Elias barely slept, the hours dragging slow until the first light bruised the edges of the hills. By then, the horses were restless, the air sharp with frost and waiting. Tahan woke before the sun, sitting cross-legged by the hearth, the beaded blanket folded neatly beside him as if he already knew what was coming. "They come?" he asked. Elias nodded. "Soon." He poured coffee that tasted of ashes and fear. The boy touched his wrist. You tell truth, he said. They see. Elias wanted to believe that. He opened the door to a sky painted gold and crimson, the kind of dawn that made the world look clean even when it wasn't. And then he saw them. Lines of riders pouring over the ridge, silent, deliberate, 200 strong, the ground trembling under their weight. The sight stole his breath. He walked to the fence line, rifle slung but down, and waited as the lead riders slowed, the sound of hooves rolling like thunder made of heartbeat. Chief Kohana rode at the front, feathers rising and falling in the cold wind, eyes dark as coal. Behind him, the warriors formed a half-circle that shimmered in the rising sun. Tahan stepped out beside Elias without a word. The chief looked at the boy first, then at Elias, and something old and heavy passed between them, grief, perhaps, or recognition. You took him, Kohana said, his voice carrying like a drumbeat. Why? Elias swallowed, the words rough. 'Cause no one else would. Murmurs rippled through the warriors like dry leaves in wind. The chief dismounted slowly, every motion steeped in command. You could have killed him, he said. Elias shook his head. Ain't in me anymore. For a long moment, the world held its breath. Then Sergeant Reeves's shout split the quiet. Cavalry riders cresting the hill behind the ranch, rifles glinting. Elias's heart stopped. God help us, he whispered. The chief's eyes flared toward the soldiers, rage like lightning beneath the calm. This your trap? No, Elias roared. But the first shot cracked the air, and the valley erupted. Horses reared, smoke bloomed, and the fragile dawn turned to chaos as the circle of riders closed, not in vengeance, but survival. The gunfire rolled like thunder trapped between the hills, echoing off stone and fear as Elias dragged Tahan behind the trough, a bullet spitting dirt into the air. The ranch that had stood quiet for 10 years now burned bright as judgment. Apache warriors scattered for cover, returning fire with shouts that rose and fell like a storm chant, their arrows flashing through the smoke. Sergeant Reeves bellowed orders from the ridge, his men fanning out, their rifles cracking in rhythm. Elias peered through the haze and saw Chief Kohana standing tall in the open, not firing, only watching, measuring whether this fight was truth or betrayal. Elias knew one wrong move would damn them all. Stay down, he told the boy, then ran toward the barn, crouching low, boots sliding in the mud. He grabbed his rifle, fired twice to drive the soldiers back from the fence line, then shouted, Hold fire, there's a child. But war never listens to reason. The next volley shattered a window, splintering glass across the dirt. Tahan cried out as a shard cut his arm, and that sound, small, human, hit Elias like a hammer. He looked at the chief across the chaos and saw the man's jaw tighten. Then something broke. Kohana raised his hand, and his warriors ceased shooting all at once, the silence sudden and terrifying. The soldiers hesitated, confused by the stillness. Elias seized it. He stepped into the open, arms wide, smoke swirling around him. It's done, he shouted. No more blood. He's just a boy. Reeves aimed down his rifle, sneering. That boy's a killer's seed. Then he's what you made him, Elias said. The words came rough but clear, the truth riding them like flame on dry grass. Kohana walked forward through the smoke, his warriors following in slow rhythm. Reeves fired. The shot grazed Elias's shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Before the sergeant could fire again, an arrow whistled through the air and struck him square in the chest. He fell without a sound. The silence that followed felt heavy as snow. Elias pressed his hand to the wound, looked up at Kohana, and met eyes that saw everything. The mercy, the madness, the cost. You bled for him, the chief said. Now we bleed for you. The smoke drifted low over the valley, turning gold where the new sun broke through, and for a long moment nobody moved. Even the horses seemed to listen to the quiet. Elias staggered to his feet, blood seeping through his sleeve, and looked around at the wreckage. Broken fence rails, burning hay, bodies both blue and brown lying still beneath the same light. Chief Kahana stepped closer, the feather in his hair catching the sun, his warriors fanned behind him like shadows carved from morning. You could have run, the chief said. Elias gave a tired smile. Ain't much left to run to. Tahan ran to him, eyes wet, hands shaking. You hurt? Elias knelt, pressing the boy's palm flat over his heart. Only here, son. The rest'll heal. The boy stared up at him, and something shifted. Fear turning into pride, grief bending toward hope. Kahana looked from one to the other, then raised his hand, and two of his men rode forward, lifting the fallen soldiers gently from the dirt. No more blood today, he said. Elias nodded, every breath thick with smoke and disbelief. Then let me bury my dead, and I'll help you bury yours. The chief studied him for a long moment, then reached into his belt and drew out a silver medallion, its surface etched with a hawk. When they come again, show this, he said. They will know you are under my wind. He placed it in Elias's hand, rough against rough. The boy touched it too, tracing the lines like a promise. Overhead, crows wheeled once, then vanished into the brightening sky. The fires dimmed to ember glow. Tahan stood beside him, still wrapped in the blanket his mother made, and whispered, You my father now. The words hit Elias harder than the bullet had. He swallowed, blinking against the sting in his eyes. If you'll have me, he said. Kahana nodded once, slow and sure. Then the child has two fathers, one of blood, one of heart. He turned his horse toward the ridge, and the long line of warriors followed, their silhouettes fading into the sun. When the last hoofbeat faded, Elias stood alone again, but not empty. The wind came soft through the grass, and in it he thought he heard the faint echo of drums, not of war, but of gratitude. By noon, the valley had gone still again, the snow melting into dark streaks across the dirt as Elias and Tahan moved among the wreckage with quiet hands. They buried the fallen soldiers behind the fence, unmarked save for a single cross of mesquite wood. Elias didn't do it for Reeves, but for the decency a man keeps so he doesn't lose himself entirely. The chief's dead were carried away, their ashes left to scatter where the wind decided, and now only the boy's soft voice broke the silence. Why you help them too? He asked. Elias paused, leaning on the spade, sweat freezing on his brow. Because forgiveness don't grow where hate's sown, son. The boy seemed to think on that, tracing his small fingers across the fresh mound of dirt. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke and iron, and something like peace. Elias cleaned his rifle and set it above the mantel, unloaded. He looked around at the cabin, the broken chair, the cracked mug, the beaded blanket folded neat on the bed. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel like a prison built of wood. He fixed a pot of coffee and poured 2 tin cups, handing one to Tahan. Ain't much, he said, but it's warm. The boy smiled faintly, the expression shy but real. My mother say warmth is God's way to forgive. Elias chuckled low. Then maybe he finally remembered me. Outside, the clouds thinned to reveal the wide scar of sky stretching forever, the land breathing slow under the sun. They stepped onto the porch, and Elias saw movement far off. a single rider climbing the ridge, banner of white cloth tied to his spear. "Your chief," Elias murmured. The boy's hand slipped into his. The rider stopped at the ridge, raised the spear high once, and turned toward the horizon, disappearing into the light. The message was clear enough. The bond was made. The blood paid. Elias squeezed the boy's hand and whispered, "You're home now." The child leaned against him. Small weight, big silence. For the first time since the war, Elias felt the ache in his chest ease into something lighter. The wind carried the smell of cedar and sage again, mingling with the smoke from the fire. Like memory itself had decided to stay, but stop hurting. The next dawn came soft and gold, spilling through the broken shutters like a promise kept too long. And Elias woke to the sound of the boy breathing steady beside the dying fire. Outside, the land still held the scars of the night before. Charred posts, dark soil, trampled grass. But beneath it all, the first shoots of green were pushing through, stubborn and alive. He stepped out onto the porch, hat low against the chill, and looked toward the ridge where the warriors had vanished. The world was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't hide danger anymore, but holds it, tamed. When he turned back, Tahan stood in the doorway, wrapped in the blanket, the beaded edge catching the sun like tiny sparks. "You stay?" the boy asked, voice small but certain. Elias smiled. "Reckon someone's got to teach you how to mend fence and ride proper." Tahan nodded solemnly, as though he'd been given a sacred duty. They walked down to the stream, filling buckets, their breath fogging in the air. The water ran clear again, washing past stones blackened from fire. Elias knelt and let it run over his hands, feeling the cold bite through the cuts, the pain real but clean. "This land's seen too much blood," he said softly. The boy tilted his head. "Now it's sea life." Elias looked up, surprised at the wisdom in it, then laughed quietly. "Guess it does." Back at the cabin, he hung the chief's silver medallion by the door, its hawk engraving catching the morning light. It swung gently like it belonged there. He poured coffee and handed the boy his first cup, both of them standing in the threshold while the sun climbed higher. "You know," Elias said, "some folks spend their whole lives running from ghosts. Maybe we just stopped." The boy didn't answer, only leaned against him, small shoulders steady. From somewhere beyond the hills came the faint echo of drums again, not as warning now, but as memory, slow and kind. Elias breathed deep, tasting smoke and cold and forgiveness in equal measure. "They'll write songs about this one day," he said half to himself. "A fool and a boy who stopped a war." The fire inside crackled. The wind carried the scent of pine, and the world kept turning beneath the open sky. And the narrator's voice, quiet as a prayer, lingered. "If stories like this remind you that mercy is the truest kind of courage, then ride with us again, beyond the next horizon."